Thank you, Humberto. I'm pleased to be back with you. Excited to have again some exchange of ideas and experiences, all of us. I'm supposed to talk today about countertransference when incest is a problem. You all have read about Joseph Breuer, countertransference complications, when Anna O developed that pseudoseiasis, the fantasy that she was pregnant by him, and poor Joseph Breuer, who didn't know about transference or countertransference, felt tremendously guilty and planned a special trip with his wife to compensate for the alleged infidelity, and at the same time was deeply embarrassed in the small social circle of the well-to-do Jewish people in Vienna about what this implied. This was a countertransference when an erotic transference was prevailing. And of course, erotic transferences characterize, among many other elements, the transference of persons who experience incest during childhood. And they create a response in us that is very confusing, very complex, and misleading. We are in some way privileged by these patients when they share with us a secret. And all the atmosphere of being peeping into a secret stirs up our curiosity, our excitement, our guilt about being somehow interested, and feeling overburdened by a sense of we have to do something to amend that wrongdoing that happened, as if our guilt would force us to be like Don Quixote, to go out to fight windmills. We share a secret. But there are many so different, complementary, distinct, different roles and attitudes that are at stake that we don't know which one we're expected to assume, or will fluctuate and oscillate between one and the other. In general, we feel intense emotions, perplexing and contradictory feelings, mainly a horrified disbelief and a certain revulsion, because they have broken a major taboo. And we don't know whether we're dealing with a monster, a victim, a hero, or all of the above. And you see the contradictions in any of those roles that are remarkable. The different roles that the patients assumed while they were growing up are repeated in the transference, and the expectations in the projective identification dialogue of transference countertransference is that we should assume the complementary role to the one the patient is in. If the patient is in the wavelength of being a victim, implicitly we are being cast in the transference as being the perpetrator or potentially becoming one. If the patient is playing the role of a favorite, which was a significant role in their growing up, was supposed to be the generous dispenser of favors and the one that would prefer the patient over everybody else, and so on. If they are voyeuristic or in some way exhibitionistic, so to say, that excites our curiosity, our voyeuristic excitement to peeping into what happened in that secret situation. To make things more complicated, one role may change to the opposite, or may vary from favorite to victim, in a way that is leading us and leaving us behind somehow. The database from which I extracted these observations were mainly 7 women that initially formed a group that later on had some revolving doors that we renewed membership of women incest victims that we recruited at the outpatient department of the Menninger Foundation by inquiring among the individual therapists if they had an incest victim in individual psychotherapy that would be interested in forming part of a group. And that was how we realized that there were about 10 or so persons in this situation, and we selected among these 10, 7 that initially began the group with us. They were between 18 and 45 years of age, from the low to the upper class. 2 were single, 5 were married. We met for 75 minutes once a week at the outpatient department of the Menninger Foundation, and we continue having a combination of group and individual psychotherapy, planning monthly meetings between the individual and the group therapists to discuss whatever problem might have come during the month. When we first started seeing these patients, I recall that I felt self-conscious and anxious about the fact that they are being in the waiting room area nearby the room where Dr. Bonnie Buckley, my co-therapist, and I were meeting with these patients. They were in some way making public their label. I am a victim of incest. And I have strong feelings about trying to protect them, trying to, in some way, leaving them the minimum time so that no one could see them. A sense that they were special and I was called to protect them was very strong. And of course then, the influence of projective identification and my countertransference in all the combination of feelings that I had toward them started gradually picking up, exercising the power of projective identification that in some way Fritz Redl labeled, without connecting it with the concept of projective identification, the role suction. The transference is like a suction that try to extract from you the complementary role to the one the patient is having. Others have called the effect of the projective identification as role recruitment. A role, for instance, exhibitionism implies the complementary voyeurism. So it's an invitation. Would someone assume the role of voyeurism if I am exhibiting myself? One couple that is very important is sadomasochism. If the patient displays the masochistic behavior, that in some way invites kick-me sadistic behavior. In some way, by this process of projective identification, these victims reenact with the therapist the relations they had with the family members in typical transference paradigms. But the main point is that they are so variable and so many that create an answer confusion, not knowing where's the north, where's the south. I have already said that one pair of opposite roles is the one of favorite and victim. The victim implies almost being treated as a piece of property, as a possession. Another pair of complementary roles are the role of parent and the role of child. In the narcissistic contract between the perpetrator and the child that is incestually victimized, there is an exchange of empowering each other, whereby the perpetrator in some way parentifies the child, pushes the child to be like the parent of the parent. the perpetrator, in his search for love and care in the victim, is inciting the victim to become like the perpetrator parents, surrogates. This has been labeled the parentification of the incest victim, and in some way is paradoxical because it pushes the child beyond the reality of the child development, and in some way denies that the parent is an adult, but it's an adult that has not matured and functions as a child looking for maternal care in the victim more than actual exclusive sexual pleasure. Another pair of familiar opposite roles is the role of being a sexual rival as opposed to being a dependent pregenital child that had not reached sex. And it's a curious combination of, often expressed non-verbally in the behavior of female victims of incest, that they dressed somehow provocatively and exhibitionistically, and at the same time develop a lot of non-verbal expressions like being children, sucking the thumb or twisting and playing with their hair, a kind of childish-like behavior. Sexually, there's a question of whether they are normal or they're pervert, whether their sexual experiences with the perpetrator had made them practice some perversions, some abnormal sexual behaviors, or whether they're normal. In some way also, in the fantasies of many individuals, one can assume that since they have had so much sexual experiences, they are like an expert, like refined courtesans, if a woman, so to say, or indeed they are shameful, childish, ignorant. They pretend to be like if they were very sexual and very knowledgeable, but on the other hand, they have had such a revulsion about their own sex, such hatred of their own body and their own sexual reactions, that often they don't know elementary things about the physiology of the sexual organs from menstruation on. They display some kind of funny seductiveness, but not have any knowledge of the physiology, as I said, of sex. The role of victim or perpetrator is another couple of opposite roles in which you can get confused when they fluctuate from one to the other. Sometimes masochism has been so prevalent that it has been extreme, with there being, for instance, forced at gunpoint to submit to groups sexual practices with the neighbors or the male members of the family, or like in a case in a farmer family in Kansas, a father who was pimping his daughters, offering the daughters services to the neighbors with the argument, every animal in my farm give me some income. If the cows give me income, how come my daughters could not give me income? So he was making prostitutes of them to increase his income. A very important image of the family is that they grew up in a rotten family that was unbearable to be a member of, and they have intense wishes to run away from, and this can be often repeated in experiencing the group as an unbearable association that they would like to get rid of, and they despise and hate. There are some societal roles that, again, I have put together as couples of opposite reciprocal roles, such as being a special, only one case, as opposed to being a despicable outcast, a pariah, mainly a pariah among peers, for having been through so many guilt-ridden and shameful situations. Another societal couple of roles that are very important is the one of being a chronic liar who keeps secret of some awful sexual practices and who is not even believed by mother or some member of the family when the victim tries to inform or report in the family what has been going on. The chronic liar as opposed to the honest informer, who when reporting is consumed by feelings of guilt about betraying the loved one and about starting the disintegration or complete breakup and chaos of the family, plus running the risk of being humiliated by the legal or medical authorities that intervene, or some bureaucratic organisms about child protection that not always have well-trained personnel and may be sometimes counterproductive in their interventions. All of this crowned by the social hypocrisy and the tendency to deny and ignore the existence of incest and abuse. Sexual responses on us when we treat incest victims can be paramount. The only male case that was in individual psychotherapy at the outpatient department at Menninger's that we interviewed and we invited to be a member of the group, with the difficulty of his having been then the only male in that group had he accepted, turned down the invitation and didn't want to participate in that group. By himself, he didn't want to do it. But this man had been a victim of his mother. His mother was a psychiatric nurse. He suffered from big grand mal epileptic seizures. And once that seizure was provoked by his father hitting him while punishing him, and after the seizure was in March, with his shaking and his convulsions, mother embraced him and tried to protect him from knocking his head against the floor or furniture, and embraced him and in some way protected him with her body. And when he returned from the seizure, half confused, half not knowing what has happened, these caresses that were protective caresses from mother became sexualized, and there were kisses and one thing led to the other, and under these circumstances they started having sex for the first time, this mother and this man. He was a very attractive man, and was interesting as countertransference that having he been for a time hospitalized as an inpatient, every woman in the staff of that unit loved him. And my co-therapist, when we interviewed him, even had the honesty and the candor to tell me, I find him extraordinarily attractive. He may be a wonderful lover, but I'm underlining how, and putting it perhaps in a kind of rather cowardly way, this on her, my co-therapist, while hiding that I had also often felt that some of the women in the group were extraordinarily attractive, and they came dressed to kill, displaying her sexual endowments in a parade almost, Often, as you know, the patients who succeed in seducing their psychotherapists or their psychoanalysts are victims of incest. Their transference paradigm that I have been somehow summarizing in these different roles is a tremendous roles action whereby the psychotherapist or psychoanalyst may be called upon to be the rescuer, the amender of the wrongdoings, or the wonderful giver that will soothe the pain, or the naive, candorous guy who would inadvertently lose control of this situation. All of these confusions about dealing with these patients is expressed in the terms that we use to talk about them. We call them victims sometimes. And I speculate and I wonder what they're not fully and completely qualified as you want as victims. In some way, let's put, by becoming a favorite in the family, they are very powerful in the circle of the family. They are like little Madame Pompadour with King Louis, They run the household. And in some way, rather than being victims, they are like queens that dominate the family out of the sexual power over the father or the elder brother. We call them survivors. And again, that expresses our confusion because that implies that they were somehow biologically threatened with death. And they did not die. But indeed, incest is not a life-threatening experience, and they have not quite been almost dead or about to die and survived. We call them abused, and in some way, of course, they are, because the perpetrator has violated their bodily and social boundaries and space boundaries, and started a non-called for sexual erotic relationship without their consent or their asking for it. But not all is abuse. There's also pleasure. There's also pride. There's also a sense of being very important. We can imagine, to put it in a kind of metaphoric relationship of incest, what would have been Monica Lewinsky's style of reporting her relationship with President Clinton. Do you think she was ashamed, or she was probably bragging about it with her friends and her other teen women around her? There's an element of being self-inflating about having these experiences of having being privileged with secret sex with an important person in the family. But all these expressions imply our confusion about what they are. Such a network of different elements in their sexual experiences that we use terms that either accuse them or excuse them or forgive them, but omit significantly the loving, pleasurable, loyal aspects in the relationship that they also exist. Often female women who had an experience of incest during childhood hate their own body and their own sexuality. They hate that they cannot control their arousal or their experience of orgasm or their desire, all of which in some way grab them and dominate them and control them rather than they being able to control it. and led them to be aroused, orgastic, in love with an inappropriate object, with a forbidden object, and they don't forgive themselves for that. The loving aspect also is present. I remember two examples that were somehow the epitome of that loving aspect. One was the case of the only psychotic patient that we initially accepted in our group, who was a chronic paranoid schizophrenic, who loved her father, and who has gotten love and care in her growing up years almost only from father. Her mother was a renowned architect in the Northeast, and she had designed the family apartment where they lived in New York in such a way that the bedroom of this daughter had access to a bathroom that on the other side of the wall had access to the father's bedroom, and father had a bedroom by himself away from mother. In some way, mother architect had built an apartment almost handing over, offering the daughter as a sexual object to the father in her rejection of this daughter and in her rejection of her husband. So far so that this woman, when she entered the group and heard that most of the other members of the group were talking about their hatred of father or brother or relative, male relative who had abused them, she could not understand that, because for her it was natural to keep on loving father. More even so if that was the only source of love. Incidentally, we discovered that she had been, while being hospitalized, visited every week by father and being together in a motel having sex, which she had found it only natural and welcome in some way in her psychotic state. Of course, she couldn't stay in the group with this different view, but the loyalty and the loving aspect with father was present there. Another example that I found it almost paradoxical, but on the other hand speaks of the loving aspect of the relationship, was the case of a very attractive woman who had been abused by her father, who, when she was going to leave the parental home to get married, accepted her father's visit in her bed the last night she spent at home, to have a goodbye night, like two lovers that were to separate. And she accepted this and talked about it, which is puzzling, because this coincided or was together with her hatred of father and severe criticism of his hypocritical appearance of being an important man, a senior in the church, and a respectable man in the community, while on the other hand abusing her. Well, however, it has to be added that this man's wife had had a severe accident with an agricultural piece of equipment in the farm and was physically incapacitated, and he had then picked up the oldest daughter as a wife surrogate, and she had in some way gone along with it, which forms a constellation that is mind-boggling and confusing. Our dominant emotional responses when we treat these patients are, as I said, disbelief, and in some way we tend to compensate our disbelief, our difficulty to believing that this really happened, by either being too gullible or in some way not daring to ask questions with enough, clinical acumen and perseverance. The gullibility has been horrendous. You have heard and read probably papers in which therapists have believed patients that they were kidnapped and raped by extraterrestrials, or that they had been victimized in satanic rituals where babies were killed and blood was spilled. And some therapists have written about this as this had actually happened, which is a caricature of the gullibility I'm mentioning. And this, of course, oscillates with our skepticism and our realism. Remember, Freud's initial seduction theory was an expression of his gullibility that led him to believe that incest was the cause, and sexual abuse of children was the cause of all neurosis. And that was the so-called seduction theory that he offered as a universal explanation of mental illness. After having been that gullible, he developed the correct fantasy of psychic reality, and it is the fantasy of wishing an incestual relationship and the conflicts about it that he later on proclaimed as a general factor that is pathogenic of neurosis. But the gullibility was there, and in some way probably a compensation to the revulsion and the mixture of other feelings that I am describing. Sexual fantasies, as I said, with the idea that Bonnie, my female co-therapist, had regarding that handsome man, or that I had regarding the beautiful, sexy woman that I thought could be like a refined courtesan who had tremendous sexual experiences that would make sex with her enormously pleasant. The main thing in the countertransference probably is that our need to compensate the patient's frustrations and chaos, plus their seductiveness, put them as rape for an acting out of a sexual involvement with a psychotherapist. And this happens more frequently than we want, that I would like to. Many analysts have written about Gaber, among others. He has written about mainly the therapists abusing patients, but this is a general problem that is a threat and a complication whereby if we treat patients who had been victims of incest, we need frequent psychotherapy or supervision when dealing with them, because it is conflicting and mind-boggling. Of course, we also experience sad for their loneliness, their being in some way emotionally orphaned, for their having grown up as pariah, not being able to talk with their peers about the secret, awful experiences they were having, confusing, paradoxical, unbelievable. We also in some way experienced anger at offenders, and in some way had fantasies of rescue. Our patient had the fantasy in this group that we started, and then we expanded by having revolving door, new patients coming, in some way entice us to write the book that we wrote, with the fantasy that their sharing with us their secret and their struggles will incite us to write in such a way that other victims will benefit from their suffering with our intervention in putting their experiences in a book. In some way I acted that, and we wrote a book with Bonnie about it. Of course, there's also, as I repeatedly said, confusion between love and hate, between what is loyalty and what is abusive masochism. A very important element that I have not said, and is not strictly countertransference, but has to be considered from the beginning when you treat patients that might be victims of incest during their childhood, is that The presenting complaint of many of these patients is not they come and tell you, I was victim of incest. They often don't know about it, or they doubt whether they were or not. And in some way, even though they know it, what they present initially is depression, anxiety, in some way tremendous disorganization vis-a-vis a coming sexual experience. Often, when they are about to get married, the possibility of getting married skyrockets their anxiety, and they come to therapy because of anxiety. I remember a case in which the woman in case developed a hysterical paralysis, aesthesia abasia, that paralysis whereby the patient can move their legs and their arms while in bed, but cannot use their legs when standing up on the floor and cannot move. She developed this hysterical paralysis after she had decided to get married, and she was then facing the question, I will have to tell my husband about my incestuous experience with my father, and that's awful. So she was not ready to walk into the altar to face all this terrible situation and develop this hysterical symptom. Once the neurologist and the psychiatrist combined with invited her to have the introspection about the meaning of this, she realized it, and she could then deal with her fear of getting married. And the neurologist, in a very simplistic way, initially told her, you don't have to marry now as you had planned. Postpone your marriage. And that gave us the space and the time to intervene and help her. But it's a typical situation that upon being about to get married, the anxiety and the guilt and the horror exploded and brought her to treatment. Substance abuse is also a symptom that often happens. Well, as a discussion, I would say that the disbelief and the difficulty to accept that the reality of incestuous experiences exists is combined by some misunderstanding that some people have had about Freud's giving up the seduction theory, as if this had meant that he said later on, there's no incest. He never said that. Dropping the seduction theory was dropping the universal capacity to explain all mental illnesses, but it was not denying the real existence of incest, expressing that psychic reality and the conflicts about edible wishes is the dynamic of neurosis did not mean that the reality of incest did not exist. In some families, the caring and the kissing and the physical caresses are so prevalent that some patients grew up believing that having French kisses from father, for instance, was normal. And only later on, gradually, they realized by checking with peers that it didn't happen in other families. But in some families, there is some kind of, tolerance for the allegedly, quote, natural caressing or sexual contacts between children and the elders in the family. We had another case that we consulted, we didn't include her in the group, of a woman who was abused by her grandfather. The situation in the family was the following. Grandpa had developed some senile dementia, or was in initial stages of it, and the mother had brought her father home to take care of him. But he managed to sneak into the grandchildren's bedrooms, or managed to invite them to his own bedroom and played little prostituting games with them, offering them money for French kisses, money for caressing their breasts, money for masturbating, and there was a tariff and a scale of fees, so to say. And among the granddaughters, they compare how much did they pay you for the kids. And there was in some way a kind of joking atmosphere about poking fun of the old crazy man, but at the same time playing sexual childhood games. And, interesting enough, this person divorced a properly chosen husband that was a responsible, attractive, successful, interesting person, and then later on became the mistress of an old man that was her boss. And not only was she fixated to old men, but she also developed a preference for sadistic behavior during sex, and sadomasochistic. But she, in order to have orgasm, she had to hit her lover and insult him. Behaving sadistically was a requisite for her to reach orgasm, and was an indirect expression of her anger at being abused by old men that was in some way displaced to later life experiences. If you combine group and individual psychotherapy, is a requisite to integrate the action of individual treaters with those that treat in the group. And we have to be aware that this is perhaps the main conclusion, if you want, of my discussion, that we can so easily be de-skilled, lose our skills by our countertransference responses when treating patients who experience incest in their childhood, that our revulsion and disbelief may prevent us either from listening or from asking appropriate questions, and our guilt, fear, curiosity, excitement, discomfort may block our true empathy for them, making the treatment very difficult. That's what, supervision, frequent and intense, is a requisite. We have to struggle to overcome intense prejudice that may blind us, a prejudice stronger than racism, sexism, or ageism. These patients have broken a taboo, and in our minds we are appalled. Are they monsters? Are they victims? Are they heroes? A mixture of all. Thank you.
I have to run an errand, so I'm going to be back. But I wanted to make a couple of comments. Obviously, you have an enormous experience with the issue of incest, which is rare because few analysts have seen more than one case if they have been that long. But when you say has brought to mind a number of things, I indeed have supervised a number of people that had had incest patients. Indeed, we have some now. And in a way, what you said brought to mind a number of things. Obviously, they come in many sizes and shapes. Some of them are very active participants and really assume the kind of queenish role that I am really the favorite of my father. And they actually become active participants and enjoy that in an active role. Others obviously are not in that situation. They are being imposed upon and have an enormous amount of guilt, fear, whatever it is that is creating the permanence of the activity, but it's not necessarily like in the first group of people that they have chosen whichever way the experience started, and it's obviously always a responsibility of the adult, but whichever way it started, at some point they became very active, interested participants and indeed valued the relationship in special ways. So there are two types, and it reminds me, I think the one you described, the paranoid patient that is schizophrenic, well, I don't know whether she was schizophrenic. I wonder whether the psychotic paranoid phenomena was in order to allow herself to enjoy the incestual relationship with the father without having conflict and guilt. I don't know. You may make some comments about that. But it brings this to mind. In the ones that are active participants, that they got really to be very interested in the activity and enjoy not only the activity but the position that it conferred to them in their fantasies in terms of the family, and the fact that they displace the mothers and their sisters, because frequently they are sisters that may or may not be involved in the same activity. But what I have noticed is this, and I wonder if you have the same experience. Those that are in this group that became more active participants don't have the difficulties of the patient that you described. And when she was going to get married, developed a hysterical conversion reaction and a lot of guilt and so on. Yeah. The active participants, what I have seen is this, which is quite interesting in a way. It was brought to my mind by some of the comments that you made. They get married, and the first part of that marriage is terrific, because in fact it reproduces the incestuous, active sexual relationship with the father. But at some point, the guilt comes in, and the marriage becomes a disaster, and the sexual activity is no longer enjoyable or pleasurable, because they have to punish. The other side of this is that the superego now has to punish themselves and the father for the incestuous relationship. And at some point in that development of a terrific sexual relationship in the first part of the marriage, at some point the superego gets the upper hand and interferes with that relationship and makes them feel guilty and indeed ruin the relationship to the marriage. And the husband is suddenly wondering, what the hell happened? What has happened to my marriage? And I have had 2 or 3 of these type of patients that I have supervised in candidates in other places. And I wonder if you have the same experience. On the other hand, the other group, the non-participants, have more difficulties with their sexuality and a lot of guilt. Should they confess to the husband? Should they not? I remember actually when I was in Cuba, a woman that was married to a distinguished physician who I saw in psychotherapy for a brief amount of time, that was an incest victim. And she never told her husband, but had an enormous amount of guilt and did not allow herself a free sexual relationship with this man because it was incest. You understand what I mean? It was
Yes.
the opposite of it. She couldn't do it because it would be an incestuous relationship. Like with the group of the active participants, they were recreating and enjoying the experience that they have had before. I wonder if you have any experience with that, or
Well, you have pointed out several elements. The main one I would summarize is that some incest victims have had an active participation. They have not been, let's say, passive victims of an imposition, but had enjoyed their sexual activities enormously, as well as the social status in the family.
anybody?
Yes?
Yeah, the question I had may actually pick up on this last concept, identification with the aggressor.
Yes?
In the group of people who have, for a long period of time, engaged in incest with a parent, who derive a great deal of satisfaction from the experience and the role, to what extent is that satisfaction something, what percentage of that group experience that satisfaction from the beginning as a kind of primary experience, and what extent or what proportion of those begin to develop over time the satisfaction as a defense against other affects that would have been experienced early on, like feeling terrified or feeling overwhelmed, as a way of coping with those initial affects that would not have been pleasurable. I'm thinking of the Stockholm syndrome, for example.
The Stockholm.
Yeah, where someone begins to identify with the aggressor as a way of coping with
Exactly.
affects that are overwhelming.
I agree with your observation. Indeed, the percentage of those who are satisfied, so to say, I would not be able to put it in statistic numbers, but there is these different two stages that you describe of the incest being an attack. Anyway, at the beginning being something that is not welcome, but is rejected and is painful and is conflicted and not pleasurable. And probably a relatively small percentage end up learning to enjoy it after going through an intermediate stage perhaps of what I was describing as hating their own body, because they feel they should not get aroused and lubricate with the father, yet the body lubricates. They should not experience pleasure, yet the pleasure comes and orgasm happens. But that is in some way across the splitting of body ego, with the ego rejecting this body out of control.
Well, and I was wondering too about the difference of if there's pain.
I'm sorry?
If there's pain or hurt involved,
Yes,
as opposed to the pleasurable, loving kind of
course.
of
If there are
experience, which would
masochists,
which would make a difference.
Yeah, of course. It's the sadism with pain and brutality and cruelty and humiliation. Of course, that's not.
As well
Yes.
as the age that the abuse or
Yes, let's say the sizes of the genitals, to put it very concretely. If the girl is still quite young and has not sexual organs of the size able to receive and be penetrated by an adult penis, the experience is tremendously hurtful and may lead to vaginal hemorrhage and pain.
Well, and if one is talking about incest as penetration versus the kind of the whole continuum.
Of course, when indeed incest is mainly pregenital, it's
Right.
often pregenital, it's more fondling
Right.
or exhibitionism, voyeurism, or some kind of other sexual games that are pregenital.
Right.
Oral sex also.
Yeah.
And different? Is there a tendency for there to be a difference whether the dyad is an adult male with a daughter versus an adult female with a mother with the son, in terms of the initial experiences being overwhelming, being pleasurable, being...
Yes, and the only male I interviewed for this group that I referred to, he did not want to participate in the group because he was very grateful with his mother. He felt mother had given him the honor and the privilege of starting his sexual life, and that he didn't want to be localized by being sitting in the waiting room and waiting to start a session of group with us, to have therefore made public that he was an incest victim and that he was in some way bad-mouthing, quote unquote, his mother. He wanted to protect her. He was grateful. He was proud, including.
Yeah, what I found interesting is, because I think about patients that, that I've had, or people that I've supervised, the whole idea of the being the special one, and the idea of betrayal,
Yes.
and it usually, crisis point being when they
Perpetrator?
discover that the perpetrator has someone else that they've been favoring as well.
Exactly.
And that then becomes a crisis point where
all hell breaks loose.
all hell breaks loose.
Yes, that like with the case of the girl who was impregnated by father, but she was going along with being the favorite until she discovered that sister was.
That's right. And that the interesting thing too, in terms of trying to preserve the favorite role, that one of the mechanisms is to see themselves as protecting the other siblings from the abuse.
Yes, that's very important. By the way, are you taking the faces of people who are no, you don't. Okay. That's very important. In the case I was describing, the patient we had in the group felt very guilty for not having protected her sister.
Right.
She took over in some way the mother role, if you want, blaming herself for not having protected her sister. More even so, given the fact that her sister became a professional prostitute and developed a drug addiction, and so was a chaotic life as you can get one. And she felt that out of anger at her sister for taking away father, so to say, from her, she had failed to be a mother. In another level of her mind, she felt she should have been, and had not protected her, and therefore felt responsible for the chaos of the sister's life, and tortured herself with those reproaches.
Have you dealt very much with incest, victim survivors, whatever you want to call it, the mothering, when they have children, and the relationship between the incest victim and their child, in terms of how the relationship develops, particularly around sexuality and sexual issues, and that continuum between, mothering and tending to an infant and a child's body, and the sexualization of that.
Well, I cannot give you details about all these elements that you elaborated in detail toward the end of your question, because I have not had that opportunity to watch in detail how the previous incest, let's call her victim, behaved as a mother, in detail in raising a child, but I had one experience without getting those details that I found it very interesting, and it's the last thing I'm going to say. Is about 10:30. Maybe we should take a break. The experience was the following one. A female psychologist from another state than Kansas and Georgia, states where I lived in this country, referred me her daughter. And she told me that she herself, the female psychologist, had been victim of father-daughter incest, and that her father had abused her while developing paranoid schizophrenia, and had been very sadistic and very cruel, and had ended up in a forensic psychiatric hospital, condemned by a judge to be there for life because he was incurable and also had broken the law. And she told me that this situation with her father, when she was growing up and the whole thing was dealt in court, became public and was well known in the state, and it was on the newspapers and things of this sort. So it was a big scandal on top of the whole thing. And she was, the psychologist, was concerned that she might have been in her interaction with her daughter acting out unconsciously an identification with her father, and trying to be possessive and trying to in some way parentify this child to take care of her as she had been parentified by father. So she was very anxious about this and referred her daughter to me, that and then I saw her not systematically in a prolonged psychotherapeutic exchange, but I found it interesting that the daughter somehow used words spontaneously without my dropping suggestions of it, that mother was very possessive, and in some way had clinged to her in a way that it had made for her extraordinarily difficult to separate and go her own way, because mother was so clinging, confirming mother's own description of the whole situation. But what I felt was very significant and interesting was the fantasy that this woman, the daughter, had of being in some way a descendant from weird people that were almost like people from another planet, that were very strange, and she indulged herself in the fantasy of relating to what were indeed substitutes of grandfather, the idea of a man that was almost like a devil, but very attractive, and that in some way took her to a kind of otherworldly life of fantasy and strangeness and attractiveness and pleasure that she in some way get involved in and cultivated as fantasies that were almost masturbatory fantasies that she enjoyed in which there was, if we translate this unconscious language, almost a fantasy of her substituting mother in a relationship with the grandfather, and feeling that she and grandfather were from this other planet, somehow the world of craziness and perversion that she felt was very attractive and fascinating. Well, thank you very much, and I think we need a break. I need a
break and